Thanks for listening to the ArtTactic Podcast. I'm your host, Adam Green. One major component of the art world that suffered significantly from the pandemic, and even as the economy recovered is now thriving, is the museum space. Museums were closed for extended periods throughout the pandemic, and as a result, these spaces that are so often visited by locals and tourists remained empty. So when we saw that the art newspaper came out with their annual visitor figures research and survey, we wanted to chat with them to learn more about their findings and really to discover to what extent museums have rebounded since the beginning of the pandemic. So in this week's episode of the podcast, we're joined by José da Silva, exhibitions editor of the art newspaper. José chats with us about several of the key findings from their survey. We hope you enjoyed the episode. Thanks so much for listening. José, thanks so much for chatting with us.
Thank you for inviting me, Adam.
Of course. Thanks so much again for coming on. So I think before we get into even some of the details of your findings, tell us a little bit about this annual survey you do. How long have you been doing it? How many museums are participating? And what exactly are you speaking to them about?
Sure. It's probably one of the biggest projects that we do at the art newspaper. We have researchers come in and we contact around. It kind of varies from year to year, but usually from between 500 and 700 museums around the world. So in the initial contact, we're emailing these museums and asking for their visitor figures. And then as things kind of progress, as we get answers back, we start chasing certain museums. Some museums are harder to get figures from than others. Obviously, we have offices in London and New York, so that kind of area is covered quite well. Museums further afield, sometimes there are kind of language barriers or other things. So it takes a while, and our researchers kind of have to be quite dogged in terms of getting the figures. All the figures we have are from self-reported, so the museums give us the figures. We're able to kind of we have enough experience now that we're able to gauge when there are kind of unusual things. So if there's any unusual figures, we go back to museums and double check things, and we can. But everything's self-reported, so we have to there is a certain amount of reliance on museums reporting accurate figures to us. We've been doing the project since 1997. We started collecting exhibition figures, so the kind of major exhibitions around the world. And then since 2007, we've been collecting the kind of total figures for museum attendance for the calendar year. So from 1st of January until the 31st of December for each year. And since then, we've kind of been able to gauge the kind of worldwide kind of attendance. And obviously with the pandemic, there was the kind of this drastic fall in attendance, which I guess there was a drastic fall in attendance to maybe everything in the world apart from online events. So yes, that's the kind of scope of the project.
Yeah, and you brought up the pandemic, and that's really one of the main reasons why I wanted to have you on, to get a better understanding of how museums have responded to the pandemic and to what extent they're recovering. I think 2020 was a tough year for them, but this past year, 2021, museums started to reopen. We saw a lot of visitors compared to previous years, I assume. Tell me, what were visitor numbers like in 2021, and did we see significant variances in different parts of the world?
In terms of the overall figures, I think the figures in 2021 were better than 2020. So if we're looking at if we take the top 100 museums in the world, the kind of visitor numbers were up by around a third from 2021 compared to 2020. But that's still way lower than pre-pandemic, so in 2019, so it's still down by about 70%. So in terms of maybe the raw figures in 2019, so before the pandemic, there were around 230 million visitors to the top 100 museums in the world, whereas in 2020 that went down to 54 million, and in 2021 it kind of bounced back up to 71 million. So even though things have kind of started to get better in 2021, they're still way down on previous figures. And in terms of regions of the world, I mean, as a global pandemic, everywhere essentially was affected. Last year, in particular, when we were doing the projects last year and looking at 2020 numbers, we spoke to museums in, for example, in places like New Zealand, who were less affected by the pandemic, but they started to close down, even though they had far fewer cases than a lot of countries around the world. They still had very kind of strict lockdowns, and the main kind of thing that affects the visitor numbers is closing down, really, which sounds really obvious, but a country. So, for example, one of the kind of surprises perhaps this year was how well, or should I say in 2021, was how well Russian museums did in terms of the number of them in our top 10. There were 4 Russian museums in our top 10 most visited museums in the world. And the kind of main reason for this was they were just simply closed for fewer days than most other major countries that we usually expect to see in the top 10, top 20. One of their museums, in Moscow, the Multimedia Art Museum, their figures were pretty much, in 2021, they were pretty much back to normal. One of the big reasons for that was obviously they were open more days. I think they're only closed for a couple of weeks due to the pandemic. But the other kind of reason that one of their spokespeople told us was that they're a museum that has a lot of young people. So I think around over 90% of their visitors are aged under 35. And obviously young people have been less affected by this pandemic in terms of it's kind of, obviously they've been affected by it, but it's less lethal. So, and young people tend to go out more. So I think that's one of the reasons why a museum such as the Multimedia Art Museum in Moscow did so well. Another thing with museums in Russia, the other museum that did very well was the State Russian Museum, which is mostly Russian historic art in St. Petersburg. And these museums are less reliant on tourism than, say, Tate Modern in London or like MoMA in New York. So that was one of the kind of surprises from the survey this year for us anyway. One big caveat maybe I should point out was that usually, so the most visited museum last year was the Louvre in Paris, which is almost always the case since we've started doing this survey. We've been doing the survey since, with total museum numbers since 2007. But usually in second place, there's usually one of the Chinese state museums. But this year they were unable to give us, the kind of major state museums in China would not give us their figures, which they said they're going to release later in the year. So that's a kind of a big caveat in terms of the kind of top 10 most visited museums. But other than that, we've got most of the kind of major museums around the world that we were hoping to get.
You said we saw a significant uptick in attendance in 2020 compared to the previous year, which is what we would hope to see considering the extensive closures in 2020. But still, how challenging is the environment now for museums? Are most back to normal, or would you say they're still operating far below capacity?
I think from the kind of the data we got back from museums in 2021, I think most museums, very, very few museums are back to normal. So there's maybe only a handful of museums that are back to pre-pandemic levels. Museums are starting to get there. For example, only recently here in London, the Victoria and Albert Museum went back to opening 7 days a week. They've been operating on the five days a week. So things like this will kind of help bring people back. But a lot of museums began, and this has continued here with the major museums in London, Tate Modern, Tate Britain, National Gallery, British Museum, where you have to book ahead or book on the day to visit just the general collection, whereas before you could just walk in without having to book anything. I think that's kind of been putting people off as well. In the US, most of the kind of major New York museums were still way down in terms of visitor numbers. There's a few museums further afield, like in Kansas City, for example, the Nelson Atkins Museum. They were kind of getting back to pre-pandemic numbers. My colleague Lee Cheshire wrote a piece which is on our website at the moment about the kind of museums in the US that bounced back, and they tended to be museums that weren't in the kind of big tourist spots. So the other one was the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts in Richmond. They were back to around over 80% of their pre-pandemic numbers. And I think the key for that museum was they just tried to go straight back to acting as normal. So they didn't restrict opening hours like many museums did or scale back. They were they were kind of they also have free general entry there as well, which always helps. But I think the director was very keen to get things back to normal as much as you can. I think the other thing that kind of came across was that the museums that did have that started rebranding also had to you have to make sure the museum is safe, but also feels safe to visitors. So, I mean, some may call this kind of what's it called, like hygiene theatre. So you have lots of like hand sanitizers everywhere, and you have social distancing. And I think if people feel safe in the museum space, and museums tend to be much safer spaces than, say, restaurants or bars, where you're very tightly packed together and in close quarters, and you have low ceilings and not much kind of ventilation. So I think museums generally should be equipped, apart from your kind of crazy blockbuster shows, they're generally well equipped for functioning in these kind of times. But as I say, almost all museums were still down. I think it's also that kind of thing of people kind of regaining their old habits. Like, I think for example, here in London, people are starting to kind of go out again, and things seem to be back to normal, but there's still a kind of hesitation with many people, especially older people who are more vulnerable, who may attend museums as well.
And so from the survey and all the research that you've done, there are a lot of great articles in the art newspaper that recap and highlight some really interesting trends. One that I thought was very fascinating is when we think about the art world and social media, we usually think about Instagram and its incredible influence in terms of discovering artists and seeing images of artworks. But apparently TikTok may be the most important for museums, which is interesting because TikTok is really not utilized by many established collectors or galleries, as far as I'm aware. How are some museums actually utilizing TikTok to attract visitors, and is it successful?
The TikTok article by my colleague Amy Dawson is interesting because TikTok is probably the kind of the quickest growing one of the most visited sites in the world at the moment. And I think in previous years when TikTok first started emerging, we expected museums to really kind of adopt it and museums they're always looking for the next generation of visitors and trying to encourage younger visitors. And we kind of expected a lot of museums to really jump on it like they did for Instagram. I think Instagram a couple of years ago overtook the other social media companies as the kind of most used by museums, or the kind of the social media that had the most followers in our kind of top 100 museums. So maybe I should reword that. For the top 100 museums in our survey, the social media platform with the most followers was Instagram, and that happened a couple of years ago when it overtook Twitter. And we expected TikTok to grow as well, really grow its kind of usership for museums. But what we found with the top 100 museums last year was that, say, there was over 55 million. These museums had over 55 million followers on Instagram, 47 million on Twitter, but only 1.3 million on TikTok, which is kind of surprising for a social media platform that seems to have really taken off recently. So most museums were kind of, let's say, not doing very well with TikTok, but there's a few kind of notable exceptions to that. The Prado in Madrid, which has, I think, more than 360,000 followers on TikTok, they did really well, and they kind of really just embraced its the informality of the medium with doing kind of behind the scenes videos, and I think even their director did the kind of very early on in the pandemic was very kind of embraced it, was kind of did a kind of run through of the museum while it was shut. So there are a few museums that are kind of really embracing it, but the majority have been very slow in taking it up. I'm not exactly sure why that is, but I guess sometimes these kind of new things take time, especially in big museums with very kind of perhaps more bureaucratic systems in place. It takes time for people to adopt them.
And what were a few of the other strategies that museums employed to try to bring visitors back into museums? And did some of these work better than others?
I think museums, I guess you have to play to your strengths. So I mentioned the Nelson Atkins Museum earlier, and they have a sculpture park, so they started putting on more outdoor activities. there's a kind of tricky thing. So museums want to get people back in, but then they're also reluctant to kind of squish people back as they did previously, where you kind of squash people into a blockbuster exhibition, and it gets you great numbers and makes loads of money in a ticket office. So I think museums have to play a kind of fine line between trying to get people back, but also not cramming them in, or having, say, a blockbuster show where everyone comes all at once. So I think playing to their strengths, making sure that people, as I mentioned, that people feel safe. I think that was a key thing. I think people feeling safe when they go to a museum and feeling kind of that it's open back to business, but I'm still not at risk, I think was very important. As I say, pushing kind of outdoor activities, the museums that had outdoor spaces were able to capitalize on this and really kind of bring back visitors, because obviously you're much safer outdoors.
Unfortunately, not many museums have vast outdoor sculpture parks, but those that do, I'm sure they took advantage of it. That's what it sounds like. And so finally, I wanted to ask, are there any other interesting or surprising revelations you discovered from all the research and data you have that maybe you didn't expect to see?
I guess the Russian Museum doing really well was kind of surprising, but then obviously when we kind of realized that they were shut fewer days. There's a few London museums that did, well, not badly, but were kind of, for example, the National Gallery in central London, on Trafalgar Square, which is as central London as you can get, and they were down 88% compared to 2019, but they're also down in 2021. They're down by 41% compared to 2020, which is kind of surprising. And we kind of reached out to them to find out why this was, and they attributed it to a lack of kind of major exhibitions in 2021, and also kind of an absence of tourism. But I think also the National Gallery, because it's so central and it had a lot of kind of passing trade, I would sometimes just walk in there to go and see one gallery and walk out because it was free. And I think that booking system that I mentioned earlier has really been putting people off. It's such a kind of, even though you can go there and book a ticket on the day, it just seems, book a time slot on the day, it hasn't got that kind of same freedom that we've got used to here in London, where you can just wander in, look at a few things and wander out. So that was kind of one of the surprising drops, I think, in terms of visitor numbers for such a kind of such a great museum, and usually a very popular museum. It usually does extremely well in our list of our top 10 list. I guess the other kind of big drop was the so maybe I should explain that the last 2 years we haven't collected data on individual exhibitions, which we used to do previously, but it became way too complex when museums started opening during the first year of the pandemic, when museums would open for 2 days, then close, then open up again. And we used to calculate the attendance by visitors per day. So it became just way too complex. It would have taken us maybe a year to figure out a year's worth of data. But a couple of the museums that used to do really well in Brazil, the CCBB museums, which are kind of what they call the Centro Cultural Banco de Brazil museums, which have 4 outposts across Brazil, in São Paulo, in Rio, in Brasilia, and in Belo Horizonte. They used to kind of always do really, really well in terms of blockbuster shows like Salvador Dali or Yayoi Kusama, and their numbers were kind of completely decimated by not having these kind of blockbuster shows. So they were down over, all of them were down by over 75%, because they were completely reliant on these kind of often traveling shows. And also, obviously, Brazil was also extremely badly affected by the pandemic. So that was kind of a surprise, just how far they'd fallen. Those kind of 4 museums that used to do really well and often feature highly in our survey. So we expected most museums to obviously their numbers to fall, but there was a few kind of like those 4 in Brazil that kind of stood out in how far they'd fallen, really.
José, thank you so much again for coming onto the podcast and sharing some of your really interesting insights from your art visitor survey that you do each year at the Art newspaper. If our listeners want to read all the articles, dissecting all the data, what's the website?
Sure. Thank you, Adam. Yeah, it's just theartnewspaper.com, and you'll find the visitor figures, kind of all the kind of visitor figures data, and also articles on our homepage. So you just theartnewspaper.com, everything should be there.
Perfect. Thanks so much again. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you. Bye-bye.